Okay, well, thank you, and thank you everyone for the meeting. It's really been fantastic, and I think we've learned a lot to move forward. I went a little too far, but you know that I have no disclaimers, and I'll just continue from here instead. So obviously, I'll reiterate what I think Peter Stein said yesterday, is that we're taking our obligations very seriously under 21st Century Cures, and not just because we have to do it, because we do want to make sure we're doing everything we can be doing to bring things efficiently to the market and keeping our evidence standards. And so these meetings, and then, you know, we sort of have what I would call some foundational guidances that are out there. In fact, we just finalized the use of electronic health record data today. And so we've built the foundation. We haven't built the whole house. And I know people are wondering, is it going to be Victorian or modern? And keeping with the food analogy, I think what I sort of hear is FDA, you know, you sort of like this very sort of well put together food. It's perfectly arranged. You know where it came from, whether it's free range, organic, it's mother and father. And can maybe you do with something larger and a little bit simpler, perhaps, and maybe we can, and we need to look at it. And at some point, though, you know, if you strip it down too far, we might say something's missing and it needs some more. So we were asked whether, you know, one of the questions was, what about, you know, real-world data? We're all focused on this post-marketing evaluation. Can we move it forward? And, of course, this is something from the National Academies a couple of years ago. And really speaking, when we're talking about efficiencies, I think we need not to lose sight that it should be all through the process and to increase those efficiencies so that they sort of multiply on each other. And, you know, we have used it in the clinical development and the FDA approval, and these are some of the examples if you consider sort of expanded access and registries as real-world data where they have informed our decisions of efficacy. And certainly there's many opportunities, I think, to rather than relying maybe published historical controls, to start taking contemporaneous controls. And you saw in at least the Blindside 2, I think they published that they tried to go back and do some propensity score matching in looking at case records, and whether that's propensity score matching is the right thing now, and we have to think about that as well. But I think, you know, and I know people say, well, that's sort of your toe getting wet, and that's the low-hanging fruit, and that's the easy stuff. But remember, 39% of our approvals in 2017 were rare diseases. So these are places where the data can be worked on and get it more experienced. And in the post-marketing setting, I would just remind you that we are very practical. So this is when kalidaco, which is a drug for cystic fibrosis, there was this expansion of the indications from 10 mutations to 33. Some had clinical data, some was on in vitro data. And for the post-marketing commitment, what we asked for was an observational study using the CF registry. So I think, you know, we're open to this, but obviously everyone's looking for a little bit more. So it's been mentioned, we have been doing studies, so we have been generating evidence with real-world data through Sentinel, and these are just some of the publications that have come out of it. And I believe, as Bob Ball mentioned, you know, there is a best practices for conducting and reporting pharmacoepi, and we can use probably some of the concepts that are in there because there's some similarities. For example, you know, this is just a section on ensuring that, you know, you've got a code-based outcome. Are you really getting what you need? Is the outcome validated? You cite literature. What's your basis? We need to know the sensitivity of the outcome, and we need to think of what's the positive predictive value and sensitivity we're going to want when we switch from the safety side into the efficacy side. And although we know a lot about claims, and that seems to be the structured data, I think we need to think about data sources change, right? So everyone knows that in 2015 we went from ICD-9 to ICD-10. And if you don't know a lot about that, that meant we went from 14,000 diagnoses to 70,000 diagnoses. And we now have, you know, we all have our favorites, you know, problems in relationships with in-laws, or injured at the opera, or struck by a macaw. But in all seriousness, when you look at some of this, a surveillance of hospitalizations with a diagnosis of opioid use disorder, when the transition was made, suddenly saw an uptick in 14% increase. And at the VA, they did an assessment of about 20%, and they said it had twofold higher odds of identifying Alzheimer's and less than half of identifying patients with HIV/AIDS and those with alcohol and tobacco dependence, co-founders that you might want to know about. So I think as we move forward, and especially things that have been done, we need to know, as the data changes, what's the validation that's been done to tell us you're reliably getting what you think you're getting. And that includes, we heard a lot about what Friends of Cancer did, and I really applaud that kind of work. This is some just validating endpoints, right? So this is one publication that's from the epi literature, and they were using Medicaid, and they were trying to validate bleeding, and so they looked at hospitalizations and they adjudicated them. They had some nurse practitioners go in, and they had pretty good positive predictive value of 89 to 99%, and so that looks pretty good, and we would want to know perhaps a little bit. But let's change the population. It's not in Medicaid, and this comes out of, I believe, Duke. And so then they looked at, this was in a trial, Translate ACS, and they again were looking at hospitalizations, and they had physician adjudication, and where they found pretty good agreement on stroke and MI, they had a lot of difficulty with bleeding. And I'm not saying one's wrong or right. What I'm saying is we need to go through this process and be able to reconcile so that we have confidence that when you tell us you're getting bleeding episodes, you are. Or as Steve said, do you need the EHR because those transfusions are not there? And so I think, we do need the EHR. We all know we need the EHR because, as Dr. Schneeweiss and his colleagues reminded us, if you look at some of our outcomes, you're not going to find them just in claims. So we all know that EHRs have the advantages of a more complete and granular picture and includes labs and imaging and pathology reports. But we heard some interesting things about what you have to do to curate that data and make sure that it's right. And we need to understand, what did you do to that data to curate and make it right, and what decisions did you make? And this is just a little interesting. The physician burnout is for annals. And actually what you see on that little graph is the average characters per ambulatory note, and it talks about, because of meaningful use, this is what the article says, there's a lot of incentives to create what they consider low-value documentation. So the ones in dark are sort of our European and Japanese colleagues, and these are the notes from the US, where we put a lot more data. So we have a lot more data, but the question is, you need to get to the right data, right? And there was a discussion, I think, of the mini mental status exam, and sort of maybe you could have two in the same day, and how do you know what's right? Maybe you don't even have the mini mental status exam because one doc's going to use that, and one's going to draw clocks and ask the shorter questions. And of course, we have a lot of different systems and configurations, so we're not talking about one record. And we're working in this area, as are others. Obviously, Flatiron has done so much in the oncology area to try and take those records and make them research ready. We're funding Laura Esserman, again, it's the oncology, with this notion of trying to collect the data once, the data that's good for the research and the practitioners. And I think what's sort of, missing is a lot of more talk between those of us who are sitting in the room who are maybe regulators and pharma and drug developers and the physician groups and the EHR groups to figure out how do we make these records so that we can collect it once and go farther. And of course, there's been a lot of, I think, accomplishments in the networks of data, and these are very promising that we can use them. We know there's transparency in how these networks are put together, the kind of decisions and quality checks that go into this, and I think that's very positive. We're also working in terms of trying to get some of the networks of the observational data, can they all talk together? So FDA, along with some of our colleagues in other government agencies, are trying to get a sort of future state where we're making sure everyone's talking to each other and we can translate this. And of course, Dr. Gottlieb just put out in the budget to increase, for a budget increase so we can expand our systems and add additional EHRs, recognizing that those links between EHRs and claims data are where we need to go. And I would say that, we tend to focus a lot on the claims and the EHRs and the retrospective collection and analysis of data, and I think we have to think about patient-centric RWE, because really all those claims and those EHRs are coming through the doctor or sort of eyes, and we need to start thinking about the mobile technologies, and maybe that means we need perspective. And this is the FDA My Studies app that David Martin developed with the Sentinel folks, and that allows you to sort of capture some of these data. And I know there was a discussion about honesty amongst patients with doctors, and the patient who, we thought you were taking the lithium, but it wasn't really showing up in the lab. And it may just be easier to tell your smartphone whether you didn't take your medicine or that you did take something that your doctor might not like than it is to tell your doctor at a visit. And then finally, we just have this, wide spectrum of potential uses in clinical studies, and maybe right now we're more in the left and the yellow, and we're just sort of getting some real-world data integrated into more traditional trial. We talked about some of the challenges and opportunities in pragmatic trials. I've talked about the single-arm studies and external controls. We are using them. We're basing approvals on them, and certainly real-world data might add to those controls, especially in places where the standards of care are changing. And then, of course, we had some discussions today about observational studies, and a lot on retrospective. We haven't talked much about prospective. And certainly it's, I think we're learning a lot. I think the decision sort of algorithm is helpful. It's helpful to know if there's agreement on certain things that should not be done, and then we need to sort of tackle the bigger questions about what should be done to make these and what is the right study and endpoint that make those kind of data reliable. And so, and I think yesterday it sort of reminds me a little bit about what was said back in 2016, is that, we talked about blinding and randomization and when can we and can't we. And it's really being thoughtful as we continue to adopt the tools and make sure that we're considering the components that we need to get valid results and minimum bias. And I think that's why the FDA is funding the study that you heard about with Jessica and Dr. Schneeweiss, to really let us understand when we need these tools, when these tools, other tools can do this. And so in the end, I think what we all need, confidence and experience using these data systems, the technologies, and the analytic methodologies. And that's what I think we're all working towards. And I think the sort of vision for us, as we said, everyone said we've got to start with the question, what can the answered using the available data and current data sources. But we also need to think not only what the data is now, but where the data is going to go and how do we want it to go there. So I think there has to be a feedback. We often talk about the learning healthcare system being learning from each patient encounter, so that each patient, sort of feeds into it. I think also as we use the data, we should be learning from the data and what we want the data to do in the future as well. And I think this is where we all want to head, and this is where people are saying fully embedded in healthcare settings, interconnected systems throughout the entire, seamless and integrated auditing, flexible and linkable on-demand aggregation. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And the question is how we get there. And I think it's all of us sort of working together: data analytics, linkage, quality control, database design, security, study designs, including randomized trials and statistics. And so with that, I think I'm still within my 15 minutes. I wanted to just say, we sort of think about RCTs or PCTs, sorry, I went back too fast. And maybe we really need to be talking of convergence and all of the evidence together and fit for purpose and not be dichotomous about it. And so with that, I will go to my acknowledgments and also let you know that any questions for us from CEDAR, we have an inbox. Thank you.